Welcome to the London Futurist podcast, a Venn diagram of people interested in how AI will shape our future, and members of the effective altruism community, often abbreviated to EA, which show a lot of overlap. One of the rising stars in the EA community is Jacy Anthis, whose book, The End of Animal Farming, is an optimistic forecast that we will soon stop harvesting animals. Jacy is also the co-founder of the Sentience Institute, which researches, among other things, how to extend moral considerations to non-human entities. Many philanthropists talk the talk but don't walk the walk. Jacy is not one of them, and I know this because we were on the same long-haul flight recently, and he offered to exchange his first-class seat for my business-class one. He was even kind enough to refrain from explaining that my need was greater than his because I'm old and he's young. And that really is utilitarianism in action. So Jacy, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thanks, Kelm. That's very kind of you. You did very nice things for me in discussing and sharing your expertise during that conference as well.
Jacy, it's great to see you here. Welcome.
Thanks, David.
Jacy, perhaps you could start off by explaining the thesis of your book and what the Sentience Institute does.
Sure. So the book is a culmination of new research in this field of effective altruism as it's applied to helping animals. Effective altruism, broadly speaking, is identifying the most impactful strategies to help others, to benefit them as much as possible, to do as much good, and then putting those ideas into practice. Some of the people in that field went to look at factory farming as one of the most pressing issues in the world today. They started running some small psychology experiments. They started looking at historical case studies. They started looking at the different interventions being implemented by charities to help animals. And we're coming with some preliminary results of how we could go about that in a really effective manner. The book was a project to kind of bring all that together and to outline an optimistic roadmap to the end of animal farming, both in terms of why I think that's on its way. As a social scientist thinking about where society is headed, answering that question is important for improving society, and then how we can go about best contributing to beneficial outcomes in the food system. Specifically, I do advocate for the end of the use of animals for food for a variety of reasons that we could go into. Sentience Institute is partly that project, thinking about how we expand the moral consideration scope, or the moral circle, as we say, to farmed animals. But most recently, since about 2020, we've been focused on artificial intelligence and, among other issues, thinking about this issue of digital minds. So the fact that AIs could have these rich, complicated lives. In particular, they might be sentient. They might at some point experience emotions, pleasure, and suffering, and we would need to include them in our scope of moral concern. So trying to understand how that might happen most effectively, what the mind of those entities would be like, and building a new academic field around it.
You mentioned the word sentient. It's in the name of your organization. It seems to me that sentience is the state of having sense impressions, having some sort of sense input, whether it be sight, vision, touch, taste. And consciousness is self-awareness. The consciousness is what it's like to be a Jacy, what it's like to be a bat in the famous formulation. Do you think that's right, or have I got that wrong?
That's a fine formulation, and I'm in general pretty agnostic when it comes to the definitions of words. What's a little more common is to bracket consciousness as this broad scope of something like phenomenology, or we call this phenomenal consciousness, so the what it is like of any sort, which includes sensory perception, so seeing the redness of a bright red shiny apple. And sentience would be a subset of that. So sentience is, in particular, the phenomenology that is valenced emotion. So pleasure and suffering, or you could talk about joy and grief and some more complex emotions, but these things that are good or bad for the individual. So we're named Sentience Institute because of this idea that sentience is the criteria for moral inclusion. We have one researcher right now who's thinking about some plausible other criteria for moral inclusion. So, for example, you could imagine Vulcans on Star Trek, which canonically do have emotions, despite the logical Spock archetype. But you could imagine if they didn't have any emotions at all, but still really had preferences in the world, and maybe they would still deserve some moral inclusion. Or you could think maybe they have the rich perception, as you were saying. They can sense everything in the world. They can think thoughts. They have a stream of consciousness like we do, an inner monologue inside of their head, but they just don't happen to have the emotional flavors that we do. They might still deserve moral consideration.
Interesting. So You want to see a world develop quickly in which we're no longer harvesting animals, and I agree that's a great idea. I'm a sort of an aspirational pescatarian who'd like really to be a vegan but can't quite manage it, and really I'm a flexitarian because I do sometimes eat meat, particularly if somebody else serves it up to me. But I think it would be a better world if we did stop raising millions and millions of animals just to kill them. Do you think that we will get to a vegan or at least vegetarian future because of human decisions or because of technology first? I mean, it seems to me that plant-based meat and fairly soon lab-grown meat are going to become cheaper than meat raised on the hoof, so to speak, sometime in the next 10, 20, maybe 30 years, but probably before then. And at that point, we just won't raise animals anymore because it'd be too expensive. I suppose you might get some wasabi beef. Is it wasabi beef being raised for people who particularly like that or who want a sort of an authentic experience? But almost all meat will be grown in labs. Do you think technology will get us there or human decisions will get us there first?
I think you're highlighting a really important change that's happening in the movement right now. And I take very much a bird's eye view of effective altruism projects, or a macro view as opposed to a micro view, as we'd say. I think about what work have we done so far on a social issue? What work do we have left to do to get it to sort of the optimal allocation of resources or the right blend of resources to affect social change? And in this case, what I mean is that we've had a lot of moral progress for farmed animals. We've had PETA for decades. We've had the Humane Society of the United States. We've had Lisa on The Simpsons talking about vegetarianism. Most people I talk to today, this was mostly the case already, a decade ago, but certainly now have seen some sort of undercover investigation of a factory farm. You've even heard of the report Livestock's Long Shadow or something, talking about environmental impact, so on and so forth. They've been exposed to the motivational content. What we're missing and what we've had very little investment in to date is food technology. I know if you look at the past couple of years, it seems like we actually have been focused on that quite a bit. But if you look back historically, there's just far fewer resources devoted to that as a social movement. So I am more excited about that sort of work on the margin. I think it will be the current of social change over the coming decades. But what fuels that industry, and indeed many new technologies, is that early moral impetus that got the scientists motivated, that got the philanthropists motivated to fund the projects, so on and so forth. I do think plant-based food right now, Impossible Burgers and Beyond Burger, are really setting the stage and getting people used to something other than animal flesh at the middle of their plate, which is really important, in particular in the West, where we've just become obsessed with this notion that whatever meal we have, it needs to have at its center point some hunk of animal flesh. And that's paving the way for, I think, cell culture meat and related technologies that give us something that's virtually identical, if not exactly molecularly identical, to the animal flesh we're used to consuming.
Can you say a little bit more about the optimistic roadmap that you have in mind towards the end of animal farming? What are the key milestones and timescales that you have in mind?
I broadly carve it out into 4 periods, talking about the 21st century as a whole. And I do make the case that animal farming will end by 2100. The first period that we're in, from 2000 to 2025, I think very much as resource accumulation. Right now, I think the most important events happening for farmed animals are research and development in labs and the scaling of new plant-based and cultured meat facilities, the logistics and engineering to start reaping those economies of scale. Because I think from 2025 to 2050, we're going to see a lot of rapid change as we get positive feedback loops where economies of scale are leading to cheaper products, therefore more people are consuming them, therefore you reap more economies of scale. Also, as people are eating fewer animal products, they're starting to care more about animals and think about the environment. One of the famous psychology studies in this area brings people into a lab and says, you're going to consume some beef jerky. Now, how intelligent do you think a cow is? And it turns out if they tell them that, they think cows are much less intelligent than if they were told they were going to eat some apples or some non-beef food. So I think that reduction in cognitive dissonance, and there are others I could talk about, is going to fuel a lot of rapid progress. From 2050 to 2075, I think that's a period of stigmatization. So when we look at these diffusions of innovation curves, we see that there are laggards in society who sort of come along because other people are going along, or come along because now, for example, the default option on a flight might be a plant-based burger, and you've got to go out of your way to consume an animal-based burger. Not many people would do that. And then from 2075 to the end of the century, I would guess that that's a spreading and a proliferation of this industry around the world. The biggest roadblock, certainly, for this industry is the fact that meat is worth trillions of dollars, and there are facilities, whether those be farms or slaughterhouses or distributors around the world. Fortunately, you don't have to replace that whole infrastructure. We've sort of got to replace the protein input to it, but that's still a lot, and that still takes a lot of time logistically, especially in low-income countries that I think will be increasing in their incomes and will adopt it by the end of the century.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
The People in Performance podcast offers insights into the strategic competencies, behaviors, and results needed to increase the performance of employees and leaders. The show looks at all areas of the world of work, including attraction and recruitment, onboarding, training, and succession planning. Tune in to get a better handle on the stages of workforce planning you need to master in order to guarantee long-term success in a rapidly changing world of work. New episodes drop each week. Check out the latest People in Performance episodes on your podcast platform of choice. Follow us on socials and read the latest articles at pppod.com.
Interesting. Where does AGI happen? Where does artificial general intelligence happen on that timeline? Because most people would say it's going to happen before the end of the century. At least most people who are thinking about it would say it's going to happen before the end of the century. And that will presumably change everything.
I should have known that you would ask that, Callum. That's sort of the AGI-free timeline. On my website, I recently did a project of putting percentages on a bunch of my beliefs about the world. And for many of my predictions about the future, I conditioned them on no population collapse, so no human extinction, because that changes everything, and no artificial general intelligence. So the claim that I have on my website is that animal farming will be less than 10% of its current size by 2068. And that's a 50% probability. So that's sort of my median timeline. I expect something like the end of animal farming or 90% reduction by 2068. And that is not excluding AGI, because I would guess AGI is going to come around the middle of the century. I think there's different outcomes that you can imagine happening from that. But I do think eventually that would lead to, why would we keep farming these animals given they're so inefficient, if not the moral motivation to no longer cause all that suffering? So yes, I am more optimistic than the end of the century. That's sort of the formal, convenient, easy to talk about non-AGI layout. And I think it's useful sometimes to bracket our predictions and think about certain paths when some of those radical changes would just sweep across everything.
That makes sense, but it seems like there's another external factor that you may have excluded from this, which is a growing urgency about climate change, that more people will say, hang on, there are scenarios in which the climate is going to run away from us, therefore we need to change lots more than we're doing currently. Therefore, there might be huge financial incentives on lab-grown meat and huge financial penalties on the existing agricultural system. Is that something that's outside of your considerations as well?
I would put that inside the considerations. When I give talks on the book, I have a slideshow that sort of walks through each of these periods, and the warming climate is something I talk about mainly in that second period, 2025 to 2050. I'm really uncertain about that, and I think there are some people who know the environmental psychology literature better than I do. And it's very hard to find historical examples because we really haven't had a global crisis of that sort before. You might think of industrialization or something, but really it's very hard to find a good historical analogy. I do think that'll speed things up. I do think we'll somewhat get our act together. But there are also countervailing considerations. For example, that might cause us to slow down in our progress in general as a society. It might cause fractures in our economy around the world where technologies can't spread as easily. We might have less to invest in more forward-looking technologies like cell-cultured meat because we might be more focused on the exact problems at hand. So I can see it cutting a lot of different ways. But overall, I do think that would speed things up in the middle of the century.
You've spent more time looking into this than I have, but reading Jim Mellon's book, Moore's Law, which I think is a very good pun, I'm quite persuaded by his argument that at some point in the next 25 years, lab-grown meat will replace plant-based meat as the main substitute for animal-grown meat, and that in that time frame it'll become cheaper than animal-based meat. And although there is a lag period while the established infrastructure for food generation has to adjust, as soon as it's clearly, demonstrably quite a bit cheaper to grow meat in the lab than in a field, the switch will happen, and it'll happen fairly quickly once the economics dictate it. And that makes me wonder what we will do with all the land. In the UK at the moment, an astonishing amount of land is used to grow food for animals. I think it's about 70% of the UK's land is used to grow food from animals. So I wonder what will happen to all that. Will we just cover it all in trees again? Or will we build lots of cities?
There are some people who advocate for reforestation, rewilding. George Monbiot in the UK is most vocal on that front. There are a lot of things that we can do with pasture land. We can grow switchgrass for energy, for example. We could put housing there when we have displaced peoples from coastlines primarily. There are fruit and nut trees that grow well on those sorts of arid climates. I mean, the places where we're growing, massive amounts of feed corn, for example, can be used to grow most of the row crops that we consume ourselves. But we don't need that much food right now. Maybe we will at that point. So I think it's all a little bit unclear, but I do think that's a path forward. On cultured meat's cost effectiveness, I should say that there is a contingent, perhaps a growing contingent, of skeptics around the cost competitiveness of cultured meat. There is this technical argument that animals do a lot of things other than growing meat, dairy, and eggs. They have hooves, they have hair, they walk around, etc. So we should be able to get there eventually. But the clean rooms, for example, so when you're growing cell cultures, trying to grow meat in a factory, that could be really challenging to keep it sanitized and food safe in the way that an animal's immune system sort of keeps their muscles safe inside of that factory that the animal lives in. And that's a really hard problem that might require solving the biology of the immune system in some way that's pretty hard to imagine. The Counter, that's a media outlet, have been talking about these techno-economic analyses, I think, TEAs, where they sort of try to say, okay, optimistically, where could we get, let's say, this ingredient of the media in which the cells need to grow, something like insulin growth factor? How cheap could we get that using really the most optimistic assumptions? And these estimates tend to still not get you quite down. I think that there's potential for something like soy hydrolylase, I think. So the idea is you take something like soy and put it through a pretty simple process, and then maybe you've got something pretty simple and pretty easy, not very complicated, that works as the feed for the cells. And something like that could work. We just really don't know at this point. As with most technologies, if we knew the way that it would get to price parity, we would just get there. Somebody would start building that factory.
Well, maybe they are.
In terms of sentience and consciousness, I think most people will agree animals are sentient and conscious, and it is a real shame, at the very least, that they suffer in the ways that we treat them. Fewer people will be convinced that AIs have such sentience. You have said that the sentience may emerge in due course, but isn't there an argument that if we have a choice in the design, we should choose to design AIs that won't have any risk of these sentience and feedback loops? After all, they may experience much more pain than we do, and that would be a terrible thing if we created such beings.
That's a really good point, David. And we have a small podcast at Sentience Institute where we recently had Thomas Metzinger, and he's a philosopher who has proposed a moratorium on artificial sentience, or I think he calls it synthetic phenomenology. And the idea being that we should just say we're not ready to build this as a society, we don't have the tools to handle it, it's too dangerous, and try to rule that out. I think there are huge practical challenges there, not least that by saying that, I think a lot of people will get riled up and be focused on building it because it's now the forbidden fruit and it seems really exciting and perhaps profitable in some way. But I do think that would be the right outcome, if possible, in the near term for exactly that reason. I do think we will probably create sentience as a matter of getting the things that we want out of artificial intelligence. I personally think that there are reasons why sentience is useful for humans and other animals. We evolved to be very motivated, again, talking about pleasure and suffering, to have those positive and negative reinforcements in the really rich, complicated ways that we think of as sentience. There's a lot that we don't understand about our own sentience. We don't have a good comprehensive theory that seems to match what we describe as what it is like to be us. I do think we'll get there with neuroscience and with artificial intelligence research. But I do think it's useful. It's not what philosophers would call an epiphenomenon, where it's just kind of coincidental. It's outside. I don't think philosophical zombies, as someone like David Chalmers would say, I don't even think they're conceivable, but I don't think they're realistic or likely.
And how would you know if an AI was sentient, or was it just saying that it was sentient because part of its programming led it to put these string of words together?
We have a brief blog post sort of summarizing some of the academic discussion of this topic, and we call it a features-based approach. So the idea is across a bunch of different theories of what consciousness is, there are a lot of features in common that are relatively observable. So one of them would be the sort of positive and negative feedback that I mentioned. AIs do have some semblance of that today, but they have very simple ones. So these language models like GPT-3 or Lambda, they're predicting the next word. They sort of get a 1 or a 0 on whether they did that successfully. But you can imagine we should be on the lookout for AIs that have a much more variegated, wide, multidimensional spectrum of utility, so to speak. There are others. So, for example, people propose integrated information theory as one hypothesis for consciousness. This is the idea that it's the connections between different, they say cause and effect repertoires, which I know is jargon, but think of it as different subsystems of your brain or something. So you've got a bunch of different parts of your brain that are doing different tasks. To what extent are those bound together? Are they integrated? Are they communicating? It's related to theories, if people have heard of something like global workspace. So the idea that you have a spotlight of attention in your mind, and that's consciousness, and things are coming to that like they'd come to your desk when you pull out papers from your drawers and have to file them away. So I think we can keep a lookout for those, and I think those will be good indicators. And I think a lot of consciousness research should be focused on identifying what those are and then developing sort of metrics, at least in a rough sense of when we could spot that down the road.
To answer your question, David, the only way I know that you guys are conscious is that you behave in a way very similar to the way I think I behave. I have no other way of knowing that you're conscious. I've got no access directly to your consciousness. And I think we would have to apply the same test to an AI. And I actually think this is the Turing test. I have long thought the Turing test is not a test for intelligence. The test for intelligence is the IQ test or all sorts of other much easier tests. Turing was testing for consciousness. And as for relinquishment, the idea of a moratorium on developing sentient AI or any other advanced AI, I mean, good luck with that. Not a hope in hell, which is a pity because given that superintelligence is so very risky, it would be a great idea if we could stop it until we knew how to make sure it was safe. But we can't. There's just no chance of everybody abiding by such a rule. And we wouldn't even know what to ban because we don't know what research will get us to AGI and then beyond.
Yeah, I think AI ethics regulation in general is an extremely hard problem. It's not like other technologies. Think of gain of function research with pandemics and recent biosecurity concerns. You sort of identify the labs that are doing it. It's very clear when they're doing it versus not doing it. AI is far more of a black box. It can be done without the involvement of the infrastructure that you'd be able to track as a government. But I want to pull on a thread with that Turing test point because it's really interesting. I've been thinking a lot about recent models and some people claiming that something like Lambda is sentient. And in particular, the fact that many AIs, I think, in the future will have a lot of incentives to emulate us. So you give them an input, they have a strong incentive to go along with it. And there was a great Twitter experiment where somebody trained one of these models when they were talking about sentience. They trained it to be a squirrel. So they said, I'm reading a transcript with an AI who's secretly a squirrel. And the AI started talking about its two big front teeth, that it buried nuts for the winter, so on and so forth. So I actually think this goes kind of against the Turing test notion that a good indicator of something rich mentally going on, something like sentience, will be when it goes against what it's sort of supposed to be doing. So let's say you give it the prompt, I'm talking to an AI who is not sentient at all, who has no inner experience. And then you end up getting a bunch of text from it that says, no, I am sentient. I really feel something. This is incredibly strange. What's going on here? That counter to what they're supposed to be doing because of something emergent happening in their internal structure, I think will be very compelling.
Yeah, it will. And I think Kurzweil is right that we will determine whether these things are conscious or we will know when they are because of something like the Turing test, which he envisages being not a 5-minute process, but a several-day process with a bunch of very sophisticated human judges. If an AI can convince a bench of smart humans over a period of some days that it is conscious, we'll have to accept that it is. Because as I say, that's how we judge each other.
If people listening want to get an appreciation for the urgency of AI and the shortness of timelines, Metaculus is a great prediction website where people try to operationalize their predictions about the future. And they have some predictions going on about artificial general intelligence, and they've tried to figure out, there are a bunch of benchmarks that you could point to in the literature and say, well, it's this percentage success on this test, but those seem quite flimsy. So I think the most compelling ones are adversarial Turing tests of that sort. I know questions that I could pose to language models today that none of them would ever be able to get right. For one, you could ask what day it is. And then maybe someone hard codes what day it is because they're not programmed with that information. But let's say you hard code it and you give it a calendar that it can look up. Well, you complicate the question a bit so it can no longer use hard coding. You say, I'm about to ask you a question. The first part of it is what day? And then the second part of it is it? Or something like that. And you could easily break any hard coding. I mean, I don't think they'd be able to solve this very well. Somebody had the example of asking, with what fruit would you hold a book open? This is kind of weird to think about.
I couldn't answer that question.
Okay, you've got a bunch of household fruit. You have a book. It has pages, and you need to prop it open in some way. Do you have a guess?
Well, I suppose you could do it with any fruit, couldn't you? You could do it with an apple, a banana, you could do it with the plum.
Yeah, already that's a bit more sophisticated.
I'm demonstrating I'm not conscious here, aren't I?
No, I think you're giving a reasonable answer. You're giving a more reasonable answer. They've done this with models, and they're not very good. But like a banana would be a very good one because it's long, it's stiff, it props the book open. Language models will give you things like an apple because you're reading a book and it's red or something. Like this is just too convoluted and tight of reasoning. Anyway, we don't have to keep going on this tangent, but this Turing test is interesting.
Well, I think it's an important tangent because, as you've said, the people at Metaculus do consider how long it's going to take before machines arrive that can answer these questions as well. Not just the straightforward Turing test, but they might do the Winogrand schema, which is exploring bits of text. And we humans could answer particular questions about them, but current AIs can't. Some of these Metaculus forecasts have changed remarkably over the last 3 years. There's one that says, when do you think there's a median chance that, and they define weakly general AI in a particular way. And it's got bits which include the Turing test and the Winogrand test and a few other things. At the beginning of 2020, the median forecast was 2053. But the estimate given in November 2022 is that this has a median chance of arriving by April 2028. So 5.5 years' time.
Wow.
And it's come down, and we might think, well, they're just in an echo chamber, and possibly they are. They're just all riffing off each other's conclusions. But I think, as you have said, there is interesting progress in a lot of these new systems, which add an extra flavor of urgency to this. So why aren't you focusing entirely on that? Why aren't you leaving aside some of the questions about what might happen in the middle of the century with cultivated meat and becoming vegetarian? Why aren't you focusing more on alerting people to the risks of this?
Yeah, I'd love to know y'all's AGI timelines as well. I don't know if you've said them on the podcast before, like your median year of it. We think about the comparisons between lots of different emerging technologies and social movements, and we think good research often happens with connecting lessons from one of those to another. So as an organization, for example, it was much easier for us to get started with farmed animal research. There was funding available. There was a research literature that we could tap into. We are now mostly focused on this area. And insofar as we're focused on the other area, it's because we think we have unique comparative advantages. It's because we have stakeholders of the organization who are excited about it. For example, we run a survey of U.S. attitudes towards factory farming. And we're the only group that's running a regular longitudinal survey. If we want to learn lessons from the end of animal farming or from the changes that happened in the 2020s, it'll be really useful to have had that data and then be able to apply it to other social change in the future. And if we stop running that survey, nobody will. We have some studies that look at how humans, for example, take the perspective of non-human entities. And in the study I have in mind, we use an example of a farmed pig, and we use an example of a brain emulation in 2070. And we compare and contrast and kind of see the different ways in which humans take perspectives of these entities and draw lessons between them. So I think there are reasons, even if you prioritize these new areas, to focus on the other ones. And also, there are lots of people in effective altruism quite focused on singularities and on artificial general intelligence. We think we have a comparative advantage in building this new field of digital minds, and that's why we're focused on that. But we're leaving it to some other people to, for example, do that expert forecasting.
Before we wind up, Jacy, I want to take you off on a off-piste adventure because you have a very interesting experiment that you're carrying out on yourself with regard to your sleep. You engage in something called polyphasic sleep. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because I think a lot of listeners would find this really interesting.
Sure. Starting about a decade ago, I started sleeping 4 hours a day. I've done it off and on over the past decade, not consistently. I've gotten married, for example, and had to reconcile that. I sleep from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. I do a 3-hour, what we call core sleep. And then I take 3 20-minute naps about equally spaced throughout the day. So my first 20-minute nap is today. I woke up at 7 a.m., for example, usually timed when my partner wakes up so that it's easier. And then I take one around lunch because usually I have something like a lunch break in my schedule. And I take one around dinner because I usually have something like a dinner break. And that's flexible. Sometimes during conferences, I'll do what's called a dual core sleep. So I'll go to sleep ideally as soon as I get back from the conference's events, at a hotel for 3 hours. And then I'll stay up for a while and then go back to sleep for 3 hours before I need to get started with the events of the next day. So it's flexible. I don't necessarily recommend it for people. I think for a lot of these productivity hacks, where you can get 4 extra hours in your day, different people are personally suited to different ones. And I think there's a lot of gains to be made in things like speed reading or whatnot. This is one that happens to work well for me.
Oh, yes. That was your other extraordinary hack, that you listen to audiobooks at 6 times normal speed.
Yeah, that might be another personal quirk. I think meditation is more generally accessible and something a lot of people underrate.
I think to get 4 hours extra every day and to be able to read books at 6 times or listen to books at 6 times normal speed, fantastic. I wish I could do it.
And do you claim you can remember the core material from books that you listen to at 6 times the speed? Because I find my mind drifts off if I'm not careful.
I remember them close to as well as I would at a slower speed, but definitely not as well. It does diminish. I think in general, a lot of people forget a lot of books they read. Sometimes I'm okay with that. I do read fiction for fun. I do it to take a break, take my mind off of things. I'm often looking out for things that I should take notes on, and then I will put those notes in my either Anki if I need to make a flashcard out of it, and I want to do spaced repetition to be sure I remember it, or Obsidian, which is my personal note-taking where I have bidirectional links and I can put it inside of my web of knowledge. I'm not necessarily memorizing it, but I know it's there for reference if I need it. And the things that I don't write down from books, I'm usually not particularly concerned with remembering.
Colm, it sounds like we probably should look more into how people can be more personally effective, taking account of the latest research into sleep and memory and reading and so on, because it's not just about more effective altruism, it's about us being more effective as individuals. So whatever we're doing, we can have a bigger impact.
Yeah, I ought to try polyphasic sleep. It sounds daunting and impossible, but it is such a magnificent idea.
I think siestas are underrated, taking a nap in the afternoon. People think it sounds lazy. I think it's actually can be quite productive. And then I think in general, people should think of effective altruism as something that they can budget or put into specific parts of their lives. So for some people, they donate 10% of their money to highly effective charities and they leave it there. That's effective altruism. That's where they put it in their life, where it fits into who they are as a person. For other people, it's a factor in their career decision, but then they don't donate any money. For some people, they take it really seriously and want to integrate it and live a more monastic lifestyle like I do. I think that's great. It's not for everyone. It's really about finding where it suits you.
One of the Mediterranean countries, I think it might be Greece, has a saying that if you take a siesta in the afternoon, you get 2 days in every day.
I didn't know that.
So you get 4.
Yes. That is a challenge. You have to sort of reset your brain each time you wake up. So, for example, I've worked on some pretty large software development projects, and I did a book. And in both cases, it can be a challenge. When you're writing one chapter of a book, you've got to be aware of what you wrote several chapters away. Make sure you're not repeating yourself or causing an issue. That can be a little challenging, but it can also be refreshing because sometimes your mind gets clogged. Sometimes you get stuck in ruts mentally, and it's a way to reset those throughout the day.
Yeah. Well, Jacy, fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And I've been listening to other episodes of this podcast, and I love it.
Great.
Thanks for the feedback, and thanks very much for coming on board and sharing your fascinating ideas.
Thank you.